Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the third of today's webinars that Risk Evolves are hosting for customers and hopefully new customers to us. A warm welcome to Ruth Waring, who is an associate with Risk Evolves and is certainly leading very much of the work that we do in health and safety. Before I hand over Ruth to go through how to do a risk assessment, it's not a black art. Ruth will demystify everything that you need to do there. Just a couple of bits of housekeeping. This session is being recorded and will be available either later today, but we'll certainly put it onto the Risk Evolves website for you either to look at again or to share with friends and colleagues. You are able to ask questions as we go through, and you can do that using the GoToWebinar control panel, and unsurprisingly it's in the pull down box marked questions. There is a copy of the slides that Ruth will be going through as well in the handout section, so please feel free to use that. When we get to the end of the webinar and we close, there'll be a really short, and I mean really short because none of us like long surveys, but a little survey just for you to complete, and we would ask please that you give us feedback. Has it met your expectations? What else would you like to hear about from us, and so on and so forth. You have the opportunity to influence our future webinars. And then finally, our next webinar is on June the 23rd. Next webinars is on June the 23rd. So Ruth, welcome. Great to be working with you again. Thank you very much. You're going to take all the fear out of how to manage a risk assessment. So I'm going to very quickly skip over what Risk Evolves do, but in summary, we love governance, risk and compliance and health and safety, slips, trips and falls. And as you'd have heard from Tim earlier, not just slips, trips and falls, but also the mental health support that you can provide employees is really important. So Ruth, principles of a risk assessment, what do we do? Why do we do it? And so on and so forth.
Okay, so the first thing to really focus on is what are you risk assessing? So we have to do risk assessments. So first of all, why are we risk assessing? And then we'll talk about what we're risk assessing. So it's a legal requirement. Any company with five or more staff needs to do a formal written risk assessment, which is a legal requirement under the Health and Safety at Work Act and under the Management Regulations 1999. Now, what that doesn't tell us is the parameters of the risk assessment or what they need to look like, but it does tell us that we do have a legal obligation to do one. And interestingly, even if you don't have 5 employees, you still need to do risk assessments. You just don't have to formalise them or write them down. So it's a legal requirement for everybody, including one person bands, smaller companies as well. So it's quite often something that companies, when they first start, think, oh, well, we don't need to worry about that because we're not big enough to do risk assessments. And then what you might well find is that your customers drag you into doing risk assessments because as you get bigger, you'll be asked to do risk assessments for work that you're doing for them. So it's often a thing which is driven initially by customers, even if you're not big enough to do them from a legal perspective. But as I say, even if they're not written down, they do need to exist. So what we're trying to achieve with risk assessments is basically it's a way of taking a crystal ball, looking into the future and seeing what could go wrong. And then rather than waiting for it to go wrong, what we're trying to do is put things in place to prevent that harm occurring. So before something happens, we're actually foreseeing the future and doing something about it. So it's a great business tool. I think that's the really important point to make. We tend to find that people see it as something that's kind of somebody else's job, or it's not necessarily key to what the business actually does. But like all elements of risk, health and safety is part of corporate governance. Good health and safety is making sure that we're steering the ship in the right direction. So risk assessments are very much part of that journey, and it's really important that as business leaders or as people working in any aspect of an organisation, that we are taking risk assessments really seriously. So back to the slide, it's designed to measure the risk of a hazard causing harm. So what we're looking at here is likelihood and severity of that harm occurring. So really when we're looking at a risk assessment, what we're looking at is we've got a particular activity, which we'll talk about in a minute, and then we're looking at within that activity, given the things that are already in place to mitigate risk, what is the likelihood of somebody being harmed? And if they are harmed, what's the worst possible outcome? Because risk assessments very much focus on the worst possible outcome, because if we're working to the extreme, what's the worst that could happen? Clearly, the measures we put into place to mitigate that risk are going to work for lesser risks as well. So, for example, if we take the classic example of somebody being run over by a forklift truck in a yard, then it's really quite likely that they'll have a broken leg, but it could be that they're actually killed. So we take the risk as being the extreme. We don't take the risk of being ridiculously extreme. So you could say, oh, well, if you trip over something in an office, you could break your leg. It could be infected and you could die. You know, we don't go to that level of extreme, but we do say, realistically, in this environment, what's the worst possible outcome? So we take likelihood and severity, and then we put them on a pair of scales. Once we've given a weighting to that, which is a numbering system, and then we, on the other side of the scales, we look at what we need to do in order to balance that risk. So what we need to do in order to balance that risk is usually what we chuck at the problem to mitigate it. So in business, that's money, time, trouble, effort, and sacrifice. Those are the 5 things that we basically do to basically make those scales balance. So if you imagine the risk of somebody falling down a set of stairs, then that could be potentially be a high risk. So it could be maybe a serious injury, so 4 out of 5. I mean, you could potentially die falling downstairs, and people sometimes do. And then you're looking at what we're going to do about that risk. So the classic example of that sort of thing would be something like making sure that there's non-slip surface on the steps, making sure that people are given information, instruction and training on how to walk down the stairs, making sure that people have got appropriate footwear, and potentially having a handrail and making sure that people use the handrail. So those are the sort of things that we would be looking at. But there is also, as we'll come over to in a minute, something called the hierarchy of risk reduction. So we're basically looking at the likelihood of something going wrong, and then we're looking at what we're going to do about it. But the great news is that we're not fumbling around in the dark trying to find something we're going to do about it. There's a really good set of skills and a good guide to where to start in terms of how to mitigate risks more effectively. And as it says in the slide, risk assessments must be suitable and sufficient, and they must be carried out by a competent person. Again, this is enshrined in law. So suitable and sufficient basically means that we must look at all the foreseeable risks. We're not trying to foresee risks that are completely coming out of the blue, but we are expected to foresee risks that are common in our particular professional sector. We're expected to have perhaps read things like the industry press, to see, I've done a bit of a Google, what are the common accidents and problems that occur in the whatever your industry is, and then that will give you some ideas as to where to start. One of the other things before we move on to the more detailed slides is, what do we risk assess? So we can approach risk assessments from 2 perspectives. We can do them task-based, or we can do them from a geographical location. So if you're thinking about a task, you might be thinking about somebody picking a picking activity, or you might think about somebody maybe moving chemicals from one side of a lab to the other. That's a particular task. Or you could say, we're going to risk assess the whole lab, we're going to risk assess the office at the front of the building. The thing to watch with both of these approaches is it's easy to forget things whichever approach you take. So if, for example, you take a particular task, you might take the task of a picker walking through a warehouse. Now, they may be crossing multiple different locations. They may be moving between a hazardous and non-hazardous picking area. They may be encountering forklift trucks, or they may be encountering vehicles in the yard, actual lorries and vans. And if we're not careful, we might follow that person's activity through their working day, but then forget some other critical element of it because we've done it task-based. Task-based is really good for if you've got lots of people doing lots of different things, but don't forget to overlay the geographical areas. Otherwise, you'll end up with something like a yard or an office which doesn't really have a risk assessment, because it's just an area that people walk through, but it's still got its own hazards and risks. So whichever way you approach you take, be careful that you have actually done that suitable and sufficient risk assessment. Definition of a competent person, normally I would take that to be somebody who's been trained in doing risk assessments, but it's usually a good idea to have a combination of two people, somebody who knows the job and somebody who is a trained risk assessor, and those two people together must be able to do the job, but also must be aware of their own lacking, any areas where they lack knowledge. So part of this process is saying, actually, it's great that we've got somebody who's a really useful person on doing risk assessments, but actually we're asking them to go into a lathe environment where there's probably 13 people that work that lathe every day, who are probably much more aware of the actual real life risks and what people really do, because it's very easy when you're doing a risk assessment from an outside perspective to assume that people do everything in the way that they're supposed to do it, whereas in real life people will actually, yeah, people will put pieces of wood in machinery so that they can stop the mechanism while they get the elastic band out, or, you know, there's always going to be workarounds which as an external person you're just not going to know. So always make sure that you work with the people doing the actual job, and make sure that you ask them about what they are concerned about in this particular activity, because there's going to be stuff that you cannot imagine in your wildest dreams because you don't do that job. Okay, next slide, please.
Why is that not moving forward?
Because it's on
yeah,
it's got automation. Right, so individual stuff. So when we're approaching a risk assessment, the first thing we're looking for is hazards. So hazards, the definition of a hazard is something that's got the potential to cause harm. And really what we're talking about here is physical harm. So it might be a chemical hazard, it could be a physical hazard, it could be something that's released into the air, it could be, you know, there's all sorts of different types of hazards. And again, a quick Google will identify the sort of classic ones in your particular profession or industry where you work. But it's really important not to forget things like electrical hazards, which tend to get overlooked. And the other things which companies are very good at seeing things inside their building, but they sort of get snow blindness as soon as it comes to the outside. So think about the car park access, think about any vehicles making deliveries and collections. Might not have to be great big lorries, it could be vans, but they're going to be people that don't necessarily know your site layout. You could have the most amazing one-way system, but if somebody is a Polish lorry driver who's just arrived from Poland, who doesn't know what your one-way system is, and it's not particularly well signposted, that person is potentially going to cause a major incident because they're going around a one-way system the wrong way. We also have...
I'm very sorry to stop you there. Would you also consider hazards such as people driving for work as well, working away on business as part of this?
Yes, exactly. It's all about thinking about things that aren't necessarily obvious to you. So again, okay. Think about all the people that work in your organisation and the individual hazards that they encounter on not necessarily a daily basis, but people driving for work is a really good one, because you might do a risk assessment on sales reps and your van drivers, but what about the people that drive to a meeting? Have you thought about them? Have you thought about the risks around grey fleet, people driving their own vehicles for work? Have they got business insurance? So there's all of these kind of extra things, and it's really hard to think of them all yourself. So that's why it's really important to engage with other people, especially the people that work off site, because again, you don't know. You could have sales reps or surveyors going out to building sites. What risks are they encountering? And it's not okay just to say, oh, well, surely the business that they're going to is going to look after them. You have a responsibility to look after your employees, whatever they are doing and wherever they are. So if you've got people off site, it's not a case of out of sight, out of mind. You have to make sure that you have been risk assessing all of their activities. Okay, so moving on to risks. Risk is the consequence, the harm the hazard could cause. Again, we're talking about the worst that could happen. Normally I score 1 to 5, but that's just my preference. Some people have completely different scoring mechanisms, and basically it's about giving a quantifiable score to that particular risk. So if it's potentially going to kill somebody, then you're going to give that a high score. And then we're also looking at who's affected, and this is really important. If we're only looking at a closed loop of people who've been trained in a particular environment, of everyone who knows what they're doing in theory, that's a very different risk environment to one where you've got members of the public or toddlers or children running around. That's a massively different area of risk. So be aware, though, if you're going to say people affected are only those who've been trained, again, think back, what's the worst case scenario? Have you got subcontractors? Have you got electricians coming on site who don't know that that's the route that people take when they go to the loo, and are going to just, you know, as one, collapse that ladder when they all just hear that bell? There's all of those kind of things. Think about the unlikely and the unusual as well as the day-to-day. Then the big thing is existing controls. So what's already in place to stop harm occurring? Very easy to overlook these, but that you'll have loads of things already. Most of us now are risk assessing in mature environments. Unless you've got a completely new startup business or a completely new activity, we're often just looking at tinkering with good stuff already. So what's already in place? Signage, PPE, barriers, training. You know, there's going to be loads of stuff that's already there. But if you don't write it down and then you do have an accident, that will be up in court and people saying, well, your existing controls weren't very good. And then you're going, well, actually, we did have lots more than that, but we didn't write them in the risk assessment. So, you know, when people articulate things like, well, everybody here knows what they're doing, make sure that you can quantify that with everybody in the building who's in this environment has had training on sharp knives, or everybody that's in this environment has identifiable training on cost awareness for chemical issues. Make sure that if they say they know what they're doing, that you can justify that with a training matrix or training records. And then we're looking at likelihood and severity. So out of 5, how likely is that to happen with the existing controls? And then we're moving on to severity, which I score out of 5. 1 to 5, minor injury, and 5 being death. So we multiply those two together, which gives us, next slide.
Oh, sorry. There we go. It's one of these reveal
This gives us
slides.
our risk factor. So the risk factor for that particular hazard. Now remember, risk assessments are not a quick and easy process. Every single risk and hazard has to be identified on a separate line. It's really important that you go into really good granular detail on this, because you are good. If somebody does have an accident, and hopefully this will prevent that happening, but if they do, their solicitor will be asking you for a copy of your risk assessment, and they will want to see that you've assessed the specific risk that caused them harm. So you need to be really careful.
And Ruth, you've given us some really good labels here. Would you just put these into say a spreadsheet or a document and work through these?
Yeah, absolutely. Yes. Yeah. So every organisation has their own. Mostly there's an existing layout. There's good examples on the HSE website. There's templates you can use if it's an SME. There's loads of good stuff out there. I would really recommend the HSE website as a good source of information for this process, but also for things like templates for your specific profession, and they will have good examples of case studies and things like that for whatever the industry happens to be. Okay. So then once we've got our multiplied our scores together, we get the risk level, high, medium or low risk. This helps us in 2 ways. First of all, it helps us to understand which is the most significant risks to our business, but also it helps us to prioritise the next steps, which are the remedial actions. So if we've got a high score, which is usually between 16 and 25, that will be high risk, which is a 4 times 4 or a 4 times 5 or a 5 times 5, heaven forbid. That leads us right into the really high area of risk, which means that we've got to do something about it. And what we do about it is going to be proportionate to that risk. And we want to prioritise those higher scores because clearly they're more likely to cause harm in the immediate short term. So basically we're looking at remedial actions. I think we've got another slide in a minute which talks in more detail about the hierarchy of risk reduction. So I'll talk about that in a moment. But once we've identified what our remedial actions are, we then have to put everything into an action plan. And the action plan is really all about who's going to do what by when. And it's really, really important at this stage that we get engagement with stakeholders, that whoever's done the risk assessments is then going out there with their key influencing skills, with their charm, with reminding people why risk assessments are important, and they're actually, you know, doing that internal sales job, because risk assessments that have been done are actually, it's worse to do a risk assessment and do nothing about it than it is to not do one at all, because you've actually identified what the risks to the business are, and then you've left it to, you know, to get dusty on the shelf. That puts you in a worse position.
And Ruth, I'm right in saying, aren't I, that HSE, health and safety legislation in the UK, is one of the few pieces of legislation where, as a director of a company, you can go to prison. Is that right?
You can.
Right?
Yeah, absolutely. You can go to prison, what's called corporate manslaughter. So if you're identified as the controlling mind with an organisation, that basically means if you have willfully left risk assessments undone or not done them at all, which is sometimes the case when you read these reviews, people just have gone la 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 when it comes to health and safety, then they do go to prison on occasion, or they get fined a lot of money, or they fine the business that shut it down. So there's all sorts of you know, techniques that the HSE, and also that the individual, if somebody's injured or killed, that their family can do to create a civil action against the company. So not doing risk assessments or doing risk assessments badly is very, very bad business, bottom line business stuff. So if we can just move on to the next slide, I'll talk about the hierarchy of risk reduction. So this is a really important point when you're doing risk assessments. I'm going through this quite quickly. Obviously, there's a lot more to this than a quick half-an-hour webinar. But if you think about risk assessments from the point of view of what's the best way of actually controlling the risks. So let's take the classic example of the risk of somebody being run over in a busy yard. So we've got the hierarchy of controls starts at the top with elimination. Then we go to substitution, engineering controls, admin controls, and PPE. Let me explain what each one of those means with an example. So the best way, I always ask my students, what's the best way not to get killed in the yard? And inevitably, people who haven't worked, lorry drivers will often say wear a high-vis jacket. But actually PPE is the last resort when it comes to health and safety. And actually the best way not to be killed in the yard is not to be in the yard, which is so simple, but people kind of struggle to get their heads around it. So the best way not to be in the yard is stay in your cab if you're a lorry driver, or don't be in the yard at all if you're somebody that just doesn't need to be there. But obviously there are examples where you do have to be in the yard for short periods because it's just the way it is. Otherwise, we wouldn't be able to operate as a business. So substitution is replacing one risk with another. In this case, there isn't really a good example, but it might be, for example, in chemicals, that you take a chemical which is harmful and replace it with one which has the same properties but is less harmful. So, you know, things like substituting asbestos for different retardant materials would be an example of substitution. Engineering controls is the next one down, and is a really important one which we must always consider when we're doing risk assessments. So what we're looking at here in the yard example would be physical barriers. So people behind physical barriers. So if a forklift truck skidded out of control, that forklift would not go past the barrier. And that's a really good control, because you don't have to control people's behaviour. They walk along a walkway. It's a bit like going to IKEA. You have to walk the way that they want you to walk. There's no choice. You've got to do it. And haven't therefore got to please people's behaviour, because when we get further down the hierarchy, you do, and that's a bit of a nightmare. So again, if we think about the point of view of the pandemic, elimination would be us all staying at home. Nobody has interaction with other people. Engineering controls really are things like masks. So it's, you know, it's hard. It's really hard to police them. And then the next one down is administrative controls, which tend to be very often people's go-to controls, but always try and get higher up the hierarchy. So engineering, administrative controls in my example would be signage, somebody being given health and safety information at the gate when they arrive, training, walkways that are painted on, but you're not forced to walk on them, zebra crossings. You know, it's all of that kind of good stuff which you expect people to do. But if your health and safety culture, another big subject, isn't there to support this behaviour, people won't do it. And so therefore you've got to police them, and if you don't police them, your risk assessments fall over, and again you'll be in more trouble than if you didn't do a risk assessment at all. So it's really important, whatever controls you put in place, that they are actually workable in your environment. And another quick point, if you put in something as an existing control but it's not really always done, that's a wish, that's not an existing control. If you're not sure, put it in your to-do list on your actions and make sure it is actually done. So if you say all staff are trained, are they really? So it's, again, challenging yourself not to be lazy when you do risk assessments. And then finally, our old friend PPE, personal protective equipment. It's great in a way in that it's flexible, obviously, but it's only down to the individual remembering to wear it. It's got to be clean. It's got to be the right type of, you know, we're talking about, you know, again, in the pandemic, the different sorts of PPE that people have worn in different environments, you know, the breathing apparatus, all of this stuff is complicated. Some work I did with a car transporter company, we found that the car transporter drivers, a couple of them were slipping off the bottom deck because they've got the wrong sort of sole on their boots. So it's very easy to think you're doing the right thing, but actually you can make it worse with PPE. So those are the key things really in terms of the hierarchy of risk reduction. But the point is that the higher up you get, the harder it is to get the business to engage in those in putting those actions in place. If you can imagine setting up a new yard, having to set up a barrier is more expensive than just painting a walkway or telling people to wear high-vis jackets. But again, don't sell yourself short. If you need to put something in that's an engineering control, remember the scales balancing. If the risk is high that somebody potentially could get killed, then what you do about it has to be proportionate to that risk, and those scales have to balance. So you have to go a little bit further up the hierarchy. And what we're always trying to do is to reduce the risk, SFARP, which stands for so far as is reasonably practicable. And again, in court, we will be challenged if it's the case that somebody's been seriously injured. How do you reduce your risk as far as is reasonably practicable? Had you taken it as far as you could in the context of your business? Had you spent as much money as was about right, given those scales? So again, conscious of time, Helen, but I think those really are the key points to cover.
A really super quick whistle-stop tour now. Ruth, I know that you're working with us on a new course all on this topic, which is run over 2 days for individuals, and that's with one of our partner organisations, the International Institute of Risk and Safety Managers, and we already deliver a risk management course through them. That's due to land, I think, in around June time, isn't it? And I know that any customers or any friends of Risk Evolve, so if you're a delegate who's been on one of these free webinars and you're interested in doing that 2-day course with Ruth, just drop us an email and we'll be able to get you a discount code on that. We are kind of out of time, but Ruth, thank you ever so much for doing that whistle stop tour. I'm sure if anybody's got any questions, if they ping them across to us on the info@riskevolves.com email ID, I'm pretty sure that we'll happily go back to them. But thank you very much for doing that. I look forward to seeing you next quarter as well, when I'm sure we'll do a little bit more on health and safety as well. But thank you very much, and look forward to seeing everybody hopefully on the next call, which is at 2 o'clock, all around sustainability ratings. So thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.